Good morning. Good morning. I will be doing some live design. You can feel free to follow along. And as I design, I'm just going to be talking about some stuff here. So, to begin, um, basically, I've been doing some thinking about what is design, trying to think of it in the terms of what I do. So, what I do is called user interface design. I essentially transform some underlying computation into something that's usable by an actual person. And so there's a relationship that exists, a dynamic relationships between the technology, the techne, the computation, and the person themselves. And that relationship consists of all kinds of features, aspects, and attributes, from the meaning that's derived from the underlying computation to that end person, to the language, the words, of course, how people feel about it, what they say about it, what they think about it. All of this stuff is coming together in this relationship and more to essentially enable this person to enact certain powers in the world. As we all know, people have powers. I have the capacity with my eyes to see. My eyes are my seeing power. Um, but if I can't see something up close because my seeing power has been diminished, I'm farsighted, which would mean I can't see something up close, I think, then I would need glasses, readers, to help me to read what's in front of me. And that those glasses are actually further enhancing my power to see. Or if I can't see something really far away, I might use a telescope to see something, or binoculars. The power to see is now being enhanced through technology. In the same way, computation technology enhances our powers to enact something. And what that something is essentially the core of what a user interface designer considers and thinks about. The interface is, how do I as a person actually interact with and engage the underlying technology, the underlying computational power, in order to facilitate the end that I have in mind. So in lots of cases, there's all kinds of ends you may have in mind that computation is particularly adept at. One of the classic examples, there used to be floors of people, entire building floors of people in green visors doing accounting calculations. They would do them by hand, and they would do them on a piece of paper, and they would collate all of those, and those would all um, have to align, and they would be turned into something like a system for keeping track of the financials of an organization, the bookkeeping system. Nowadays, um, it's much better to have a computer which it doesn't make the same kind of errors, doesn't require the same kind of cognitive input to do the bookkeeping for an organization. So there's computation is particularly adept at quantified tasks. So if there's something that's large and complex calculations, that's what it's best at. It's not typically quite as good at things that are more qualitative. For instance, things like uh, even AI generated, quote unquote AI generated. That's essentially computation generated art pieces. We don't consider to have the same degree of qualitative value as someone who creates it by their own artistic capacity. They're using tools when they paint. They're using the techne of a canvas. They're using the techne of a brush, and they're putting that into an actual beautiful artwork. And they're using their internal capacity to intuit what makes something beautiful, what makes something meaningful, valuable, good. And they're connecting what they're seeing with what they are hoping for that art piece to eventually be. And they're making continued refinements and iterations and revising that until it's that thing that actually is reflective of what they consider to be good enough, whatever that inside of them says, I've done it. Um, but that's different than if you program a computer to algorithmically or quantitatively, computationally, we'll just say, because of course there's large language models, there's mathematics galore happening behind the scenes I'm not going to get into. But ultimately, computation, creating an image, is not the same on a qualitative level. So again, quantitative things, really great. Now, Where the quantitative and qualitative play together is where I end up spending most of my time. Because in practical terms, when it comes to getting towards an end that you have in mind, just accomplishing a goal, in practical terms, it's actually most everything in life is quantitative and qualitative, especially in our modern society. So today I'm working through something that's basically I'm trying to create a design. I'm trying to create the patterns, which are things like the spacing, the layout, the typography, the colors, the style, the contrast, the repetition. All of these things are part of my sort of cognitive toolbox, the the things that are going on in the background for me as I'm looking at and evaluating different interfaces. I'm taking all of those ideas, those concepts, and through my intuitive knowledge as well of what makes good software, not only because of my own personal experience of what makes good software, but because of my study of software systems and how various software systems work and how they're able to be expressed in the world. You think about, like web applications are my primary domain of expressing how software could be interacted with by a human. And there's all kinds of like technical realities that we have to keep in mind when we're working with the medium of a web application. Of course, mobile applications are a common medium as well. So those constraints are things like, well, how does a database work? How does how do you connect to the underlying pieces of functionality that an engineer would have to keep in mind so that they can actually put things together in a way that makes sense and actually is like structurally sound. So there's the function on the user's end, and there's the structure on the engineer's end, and sort of those two things have to merge in a way that allows the end user to say, "Wow, this is highly functional for me," or we might call it highly usable, very useful, very pleasing, even perhaps for me to use. And then there's the structure where they have to say, "This is highly efficient, and it's sound, and it's secure, it's reliable, it's performant, it's maintainable, it's the code is legible." So all of the coding is essentially translating instructions from a human, putting those instructions into a format that an underlying computation device, not a GPU, CPU, whatever, computation, we'll just say a computer can read, understand, and actually do something with. It can translate that instruction into machine language. And that machine language is typically zeros and ones. You've seen these binary matrix thing. It's like zeros and ones. It's not like the matrix actually, but zeros and ones. That binary language, it's like all these little electrical switches turning on and off to say, when these electrical switches are placed like this, that means, for instance, in very simple frame, that means the number one, or that means the number zero, or that's the letter A, and there's been so much effort put into making sure all of these layers of the computational, we call it the stack, actually become something that we can make instructions interact with the underlying computation reliable, consistent. We used to talk a lot about deterministic programming. So we would say there's a one-to-one relationship between my putting a instruction into the computer and the underlying output that I get, and it's repeatable, it's reproducible, it's going to happen every time for the most part. There's always like tiny little variations that happen because of electronics. Like sometimes things just go funky, as you've seen with if you've ever interacted with computer devices, technology gets glitchy quickly. That's not the point. The point I'm saying is we used to be very much like, what matters is deterministic reproducibility. Today, in our modern computing era, the last couple of years, we've started to play around with non-deterministic, probabilistic forms of computation, where you're saying, I'm going to allow the computer itself to give me, to make guesses, to make stabs in the dark that are not quite random, not quite totally random, because I've sort of guided it towards a possible sort of area, but it's also not so hyper specific that it's only the thing that I am saying it should do. And so when you add a little bit of probabilistic operating layer in here, it's like if you go from like the total set of possible like options here all the way down to the specific thing that you create. Basically, probabilistic computation allows us to say we're going to like do a little bit of opening up the aperture, as it were, to allow all of the possible um, computationally viable solutions, i.e., a set of code. We're going to say, like, you could do it the specific way that I've thought of here at the end, but I'm going to also allow for this other, dozens of other ways that I'll allow the computer to tell me about, because maybe if I look at one of those ways, it's like, oh, actually, that's a better way than I had previously thought. Let's actually go with that direction. Now, this is all very, I'm sure, a lot to hit you with, but what that understanding all of that allows us to do as a software interface designer, it allows me to say, okay, well, first of all, what is possible in the world of computation? For instance, I could say, why don't we have a software program that I can use to ride a hot air balloon? I want to guide a hot air balloon up into the sky. It's like, okay, well, what? There's lots of things that have to happen for that to be feasible, for that to actually exist. It's like, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about turning on the mechanism that would actually make the flame go up into the hot air balloon? If that's the case, you need some kind of CPU attached to some kind of mechanism. Like, what are you talking about here? So it's like, you think about, is it telling it over a period of time we're going to have like 10 seconds that it's going to, what's all going on with that specific mechanism? And the answer is, fundamentally, what I really care about, the answer is, well, what do the persons who are using the computation care about? What is actually meaningful to them? And so that's where, full circle, this whole conversation for me is all about that relationship between the underlying computation and the person that is trying to achieve some end. So ultimately, the person is actually the central, more important of those two nodes. If you think about those as two nodes, it's like you've got computation, you've got person on the other hand. The person is actually more important because persons are actually able to. There's a lot of like theological underpinnings to this here, and like philosophical, whatever. I'm just going to say it straightforwardly, and we could do some of the steps to get to this point. But the person is actually, as my friend Luke likes to say, the nexus and locus of all meaning. um, and the person is that, not there's not some like system of computation that's that. Now, it's a little confusing because, anyway, I'm not going to get into all of this. The point being, when I focus in on the person, I can understand from that person's perspective the pain that they're dealing with, the struggle that they're facing, the tensions that dominate their life, the conflicts. There's a narrative that can start to develop where we can start to see. Uh, I'm a. Let's just throw this example out there. I am um, a person who is trying to order food so that it will show up at my door. Well, I might open the Uber app and accomplish that through like DoorDash or Uber Eats or whatever, and actually get food to my door because as the person. What will that mean to me? That means I have food in my house. Now, we could discuss, of course, the ethical ramifications of that. Like, is it worthwhile for someone to be able to simply push a button and have food show up at their house, like, and pay some market valued sum in order to sort of roughly get at the cost of that? Like, okay, we could discuss that. But that person's goal and the struggle that they have is guiding the shape of the software solution, the interface itself. The interface itself is ultimately just like a form and some buttons, but it's accomplishing these real things in the world. And so sometimes people get confused. They think user interface design is just sort of what you see. It's really not just what you see. What you see is literally just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I shouldn't say literally. It's metaphorically the tip of the iceberg. It's there's so much going on underneath all of that that has to do with the sociological conditions that allow for people to organize in a way where someone is out there driving around waiting for someone to push a button to say, bring me food. um, and all of that is part of the interface design because it's the relationship between the person and the underlying computation that produces a sociological kind of physical, real outcome. The reason I'm trying to get really clear on this is because lots of times in computation land, lots of people get so focused not on the person themselves, but the actual the computation under here. And they say, look at all these amazing things we can do with compute power. We can do this thing and that thing. And it's like exciting and interesting and fun. And like as someone, if you really love systems and like technology, you can get so absorbed. Like this is a kind of an engineering mindset. You might be so absorbed with the like the magic, the power of what's possible, that you lose the connection to the value, the actual progress that someone might make with that thing. So it turns out there's a really massive set of possible things, but does anyone care? That's a tiny, much tinier set. It's a very small set. And it's really my responsibility as a user interface designer to navigate that gap between what people care about and what's actually possible with technology. So, in broad brushstrokes, what is possible with technology? We have most of our technological interactions with information technology, at least, is through a two-dimensional screen. That two-dimensional screen, we use this word affordances. It affords certain activities. We have a two-dimensional screen that we might tap on with our fingers. We might click on something with our mouse. There's input and there's outputs. So I input to that two-dimensional screen using a keyboard, a mouse, etc., and I get an output of some kind of visual representation of what I've done through a monitor is the typical form. But there's also audio. There might be haptic response, with that little vibration when you tap on your keyboard. That gives me some indication that there's been an input in and an output out, and something's occurred. So capable designers are really trying to find the most effective way to convey the meaning of what's happening with the computation to the user so that they have confidence that what's going on is being executed consistently with how they intend to execute their action in the world. Now, problems arise when people like me who have a sense of the psychological realities underlying these things don't have an ethical backbone, let's say, or they're maybe put into places where there's a strong financial incentive to discard their ethical framework. And then they use their psychological techniques and tricks to actually, instead of expanding the value that they're giving to people, they extract value from people. And we've seen this in obvious forms in terms of like the algorithmic feed that we've all gotten accustomed to, just seeing endless slop that instead of me having a goal, like when you go to this algorithmic feed, you didn't have an explicit goal. Maybe you had an implicit goal of just wanting to relax or chill. But a lot of us are finding we're actually engaging with the technology in a way that's contrary to our explicit goals. And we find ourselves unable to break free from the grip that feed has on us because it's giving us certain dopaminergic and other responses that are actually feeding our desire for pleasure, satisfaction, all these things. But that feeding of our desire, that's funny that the word feed is used. It literally is feeding us. I never thought of that before. That feeding of the desire isn't particularly like meaningful or robust on a deep level. It's superficial. And so you'll notice we've just introduced this layer of like, well, I thought I had a user, I had a stated goal of that user. They need to make progress towards that goal. And therefore the interface needs to allow for the underlying computation to help the user to make progress towards that goal. And when it fails to do that, then the user interface has failed. But now we're talking about something totally different, which is I'm just a person who's engaging with something like almost like an entertainment system or the words aren't quite there for it yet. It's too ephemeral. It's a little abstract, but I'm engaging with something in a way that's more passive. Let's say I'm more passively just sort of consuming, a lot like I would a television, but like it's sort of a little bit more interactive than that. And I have a little bit more choice. And then in, the 70s, the television, there was like 4 channels. Now it's like there's a million possible content things out there, and I get the very sliver of fragmented content that's like hyper personalized to my own experience, and that's not a lot. That's things that are happening there. It's hyper individuating me as a person. It's fragmenting me out from the experience of all my other fellow humans. And you might say, well, is that good or not good? Is that good or bad? And that all ultimately depends on, well, what is your understanding of what is good? So now I've in before, what I was just saying, there's a user, they have a goal, and they have, maybe there's a stated goal and they are trying to make progress towards the goal. You could say all that in a way which was, at least at first blush, I should say, seemingly quote unquote objective. That is, it was seemingly a neutral statement, that we were operating in this neutral territory, this non-values judgment territory of just like, well, people just trying to get things done, and they use computers or technology to do that. But the reality is, there's actually underlying value statements. There's value judgments that we're all making all along. And that value judgment initially, like, is the first goal that we've made even worth pursuing? That's an obvious case where we might say, is that goal worthwhile? Let's say the goal that I had was to was to take funds from some other person's bank account, and I used computation to achieve that. Well, we'd be able to assess, is that the right goal? Should we not pursue that goal? And my view would be no, that's not. And it's not just my view. Here's what's ultimately I'm getting at. We ultimately are all participating in a set of values which is received at some level and requires us to um, essentially discern whether or not what we've received is worth continuing in or not, if it's continuing to produce goodness or not. And so there's a hierarchy of goodness that we're all just inherently presently, I don't want to say trapped in, but it's like we are part of. We are always having to decide if what we're pursuing is good or not good. And to just pretend that that doesn't exist is, I think, is the reason why companies that use computation in order to achieve more malevolent ends um, are able to flourish in ways that maybe if we had a little better kind of understanding of these things, we wouldn't give them a pass quite as easily. So, you know, earlier I was asking the question, do you think it'd be good then that we allow ourselves to be algorithmically addicted, let's say? And I would say, no, that was not a good user interface design, even though it is fulfilling an implicit goal of just wanting to be entertained. Because what I'm essentially saying is that implicit goal is a sub goal. It's a sub goal that isn't particular. It's not offering up the highest of what I think a human could or should be. It's not elevating what you might call the nobility of humanity. It's not producing something like a movement towards the telos of what a person is meant to be, what they could be, what they have the potential to be. We're not actualizing the potential of a person. We're keeping them locked in the just sort of the nord, just the way they are today. We're keeping, and in fact, there's some contraction of who they are as a person, and what the fruits of their goodness could be greater. And we're sort of saying, no, let's just keep them zoned out, checked out, and passive, I guess is what I would say. So that idea of passive is a good way. Is it making me passive? Am I less agentic or more agentic? There's a good way to identify how value, like, is a user interface actually participating in the hierarchy of like ascendance or descent. Are we ascending higher or are we descending lower? Am I becoming more agentic or am I becoming more passive? So that's that's an entire embedded value system that is also present as I'm engaging in user interface design, right? And it doesn't exist independent of the perspectives, goals, worldviews, intentions of the leaders who I'm serving as a user interface designer. So take a step back, we realize software like Facebook wouldn't be Facebook if Zuckerberg didn't want it to be that way. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, he has lieutenants and they do his bidding, you know, but he's the one who at the head is driving the direction of the ship, and his ethos, his attitude, approaches, his mindset is being passed down and also being brought back. It's being gathered back up into action, and those actions are the multitude of those actions have produced what we were experience today as Facebook or Meta. So, for instance, he has this vision for seeing, like, he had this sort of like 3D glasses were going to be in the metaverse vision, changed his whole company's name based on that vision. Turns out that vision was not consistent with most ordinary people's vision for what makes a good, flourishing life. Thank the Lord. But he has a vision for that, and that enacts all kinds of action towards. We need to figure out all of the particular technical details around what a VR glasses experience is like. There's all kinds of mathematical, technical, deeply scientific, interesting, like engineering challenges that they had to solve in order to make it so that someone could represent themselves in a virtual space in a way that's semi consistent with how they actually appear. Okay. That's just an example of, well, the head of an organization drives the rest of the organization, the body of the organization, towards a goal. That's how heads and bodies work. And as a user interface designer, I have to be aware of who are the heads of the organizations that I'm serving. What do they value and care about? What will they be willing to sacrifice in order to make the end that they have in mind? Are they going to, because we all sacrifice, right? We all sacrifice. Are they going to sacrifice their end users for their own personal well-being and their own personal flourishing? Or are they going to sacrifice themselves for the well-being of their end users? Okay, it's that simple. Are you extracting from, or are you adding value to? I like to think about this in terms of sheep and shepherds. As a shepherd who cares for sheep, the sheep are the end users in this analogy. The shepherd is the head of the organization, the head and the body, essentially. Shepherd has a head and a body. The head and the body of the organization, and the body would be the people who work in the organization who consistently say, I'm going to keep doing this work, and they show up at the work. The head would be like the CEO, the person with decision-making authority, who gets to decide what we're doing. If you have a board of directors, that gets a little tricky, I understand, but you still, as a CEO, you're the one making those decisions. So in that situation, as the shepherd, are you taking care of the sheep? And as you take care of those sheep, you're feeding them, you're nourishing them, you're bringing them to good water, you're making sure that they're cleaned, that they don't get too overfilled with wool. Do you actually care for those sheep? And if you do, then the reality is the sheep are going to produce wool, and you're going to be able to take off the excess of their wool and turn that into something valuable and sell that and make a profit. And that profit is going to enrich you, the shepherd. It's going to allow you to make your living, you get to eat. Great, like, or are you just going to go kill all of your sheep? Okay. Are you going to slaughter every single one? Of course, some sheep you'll even, like, the reality is the circle of life, people. Things have to move through, like, there's a point in which a sheep needs to be slaughtered, and that's what's best for everything. Okay. I'm not trying to beat around the bush in that way. I'm not saying you never slaughter a sheep, and I'm not saying you should slaughter your end users. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to make the analogy of, like, if you eat all the sheep, the whole system dies. Your shepherd can't be a shepherd. He's no longer a shepherd. So are you a wolf or are you a shepherd? Do you eat the sheep, or do you care for the sheep? Really, that's the question. You could also be a shepherd who's a bad shepherd. Do you care for the sheep as a shepherd, or do you sort of, like, do you get lazy? Do you not really care? Do you, like, when bad things happen, do you just sort of let the sheep go to the wolf? Or do you step in and you say, no, This isn't happening. I'm here. The buck stops with me. I'm taking responsibility. I'm come hell or high water, I'm going to sacrifice myself for the sheep. So ultimately, I mean, that's maybe you're saying, Sam, you're so idealistic. That is the ideal. That is the ideal that we're hoping for, right? In our leaders, in the heads of organizations. And that's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm thinking about when I'm doing user interface design. I'm thinking, okay, does this organization, does this leadership, do they value self-sacrificial service for the end user? And if so, will they be therefore willing for us to engage in the kinds of activities that require us to deeply understand what makes a user's world better or worse and how this technology is affecting them in a way that's truly affecting them? Like, is it actually making their lives better or worse? And if so, like, if something goes wrong, if there's a choice we have to make along the lines to either like just say, well, it could be much better designed, but we just don't have the time or the money or the will to make it happen. So we'll just sort of like keep on going with this lower quality direction. Like, those decisions will add up. And essentially you will become like the shepherd who just says, what does it matter? And you'll see that the sheep end up suffering because of that. So those are my first thoughts. I just want to share big picture thoughts on user interface design here. It struck me that what I was doing as a user interface designer needs to be passed on in some way. I need to like help other people understand how I do this, because I think for one, I'd like my own children one day, if they get into this field, I'd like other people who do this kind of work, I'd like them to learn how to think about these in bigger terms, bigger picture concepts. And then we can talk more about, well, how does that practically like get down into the nitty gritty of like the day-to-day work? What does that look like when you paint a screen, for instance? What are the decisions you're actually making in the day-to-day? So maybe we'll talk more about that in the future, but I realize we're getting kind of long in the tooth here. So I hope that was helpful, and we'll hopefully catch you around. Thanks.